Hello, welcome everybody. Lovely to have so many of you on the line for the next in our series of Property Master webinars. Some of you may be new to us, so just a quick reminder, Property Master is the leading online broker that specialises in buy-to-let mortgages. So we deal pretty much exclusively with landlords. So we've picked on a topic we know many landlords are interested in and concerned about, which is planning permissions. And I'm absolutely delighted to have with us today Martin Gaine. Welcome, Martin. Good morning. Martin is a chartered town planner. I'm going to be asking him in a moment quite what that means, and the author of a book with a brilliant title about how to get planning permission, an insider's view, because Martin is and was an insider, and he's now here to help us. And obviously, as ever, we've got Angus Stewart with us, Property Master's Chief Executive. And Angus, maybe if we could just start with you giving a bit of an update on the housing markets and the mortgage market at the moment. What's going on, what we should know about?
Yeah, morning, Chris. Morning, Martin. Morning, everybody. Well, we continue to have a volatile and interesting market. I mean, the buy-to-let mortgage market and mortgages have grown to a record high. There were just over 2 million outstanding buy-to-let mortgages at the end of June, up from 1.65 million end of 2014. So we're seeing continued growth in this marketplace, and that's despite the fact that we're seeing an increase in pricing. We all know that despite all the speculation a year or so during the pandemic that we were going to see house prices fall. We've seen 7 or 8% rise in prices, and it looks as though it's continuing. I mean, some of the stuff I'm reading is that they still think post the September stamp duty holiday at the 250,000 level in England, we're going to see continued slight rises in prices in October, and then maybe some stabilisation. But I think everybody's sitting out there, and nobody's got a really good crystal ball to understand exactly what will happen as we move forward. But I don't think it's going to be the sudden drop in prices that at one stage was being suggested as furlough came to an end and the £20 a week subsidy on universal credit was dropped. So it's interesting. We know that there's significant pent-up savings in the marketplace as people, or many people, were able to save over the past year. Clearly, I think we've got a country which was split into haves and have-nots. People were able to continue to working from home, and unfortunately, those people who maybe in hospitality or travel who suffered badly in that. And that's changed the shape of the housing market, because there's this continued desire to work from home for many people who've had that opportunity. We're seeing many companies enabling people to work from home 2 or 3 days a week and maybe go into the office a couple of days a week. And I think that trend's going to continue. And that's, again, having an impact on the housing market as we know it and see it today. We're seeing continued demand for properties, predominantly outside central London, and there's a lack of supply. So prices inevitably are continuing to increase there. But people want the space; they want the ability to work from home. They might want a garden, which they didn't have, and that's giving us this fundamental shift in the marketplace as. And that's great for landlords. I mean, although your prices may be going up, we're also seeing rents going up because the demand is there. So I think yields on the whole are looking pretty healthy, and may that continue for our customers. This webinar is going to be focused on planning, and it's great to have Martin here to talk about planning. But if you've got any other more general questions on the buy-to-let market, feel free to stick them in the chat. We'll be monitoring that as we go through, and I'll do my best to answer any more general questions that you might have as a buy-to-let landlord. But back to Chris and Martin, and let's learn a lot about planning and permitted development.
Thank you very much, Frank. Yeah, as Angus has said, there is an ask a question box as well, or indeed you can put your question in the chat box. I'm sure as you hear Martin speaking, you'll realise what an expert he is. So if you have any planning issues at the moment, he's definitely the man from what I can see. So Martin, tell us a little bit about yourself and a chartered town planner. What exactly does that mean? And it sounds like quite a difficult thing to achieve.
Well, a chartered planner is a planner who's a member of the RTPI, which is the Royal Town Planning Institute. And it really just means that it's a planner who has an accredited degree in planning and has a certain amount of experience and has gone through a kind of application process where that has all been checked and verified. So you don't need to be a chartered planner to work as a planner, but it's just a kind of a tick to say that a planner has a certain amount of experience and knowledge. And you asked about my own background. I actually started out as an estate agent many years ago in lettings and sales. And it's really great to talk to landlords today because I'm a landlord myself. And that's really how I started out. I worked for years in West London selling and letting houses and flats. And then kind of peaked a little bit and thought, well, where do you go next? And I thought to myself that really property, to make money from property as an investor, the secret is in planning, because through planning you can add value without really spending a lot of money. You just need to submit an application, and a little planning knowledge goes a long way. And I thought this really was the way to go. So I did a planning master's degree and started work in local councils as a case officer. And so I spent maybe 10 years in various London boroughs deciding endless small scale applications, loads of single story rear extensions and loft conversions and all that kind of thing, which a lot of planners look down on, but frankly, I loved it. I prefer the smaller stuff. You get to meet real people. You've a large number of small applications that you kind of rattle through. So I loved it. And it's there, of course, that I learned everything I now know about planning. And the beauty of learning it inside a planning council, inside a planning authority, was that you see really how it works in practice, because planning is all about rules and planning policies, but it's not really black and white in practice. In reality, decisions are made in a slightly different way to that, and you do need to know a little bit about the mechanics of a planning department and how they really work, how to get to understand their culture, and how to not manipulate it exactly, but how to nudge a decision in the right direction. So I'm still a landlord. It's never black and white. It's never black and white. So yeah, so that's my background. So I left the councils to set up my own consultancy, Just Planning, which I did in 2014. So I've been doing it now for about 8 years, and my focus is on problem solving for homeowners and developers on the smaller scale. So I don't really do kind of basic applications. I do where someone has applied and something is going wrong, or something is a bit tricky, or something unexpected, or they have enforcement problems or something like that. So it's a lot of extensions still, and a lot of flat house conversions, new dwellings on infill sites, that kind of thing. Excellent. And the new permitted development right.
Yes, exactly. Well, that was really the idea behind the webinar. And then when we started looking into it, we realised that planning is such a big issue even beyond that. But picking up on what Angus was saying a moment ago, there is such a lot of demand for accommodation at the moment. And I'm wondering, if that is behind what the government is doing with the permitted development rights. So could you tell us what the permitted development rights are and what's changed from August the 1st, I understand, what's actually happened?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. The permitted development revolution is all about the housing supply crisis. So the government is aware that we're not building enough houses. We've this ongoing shortage, and it believes that the planning system, which is basically run in practice at local level, is not performing. It's not delivering the new homes that we need. So rather than reform the planning system directly, it's short-circuiting it. It's kind of bypassing it and creating new rights. Now, permitted development is an old thing in planning. It's types of development that you can carry out without needing full planning permission. So most of you will probably be aware of the most common types, which are to do a little extension to your house, to convert your loft, build a little porch. All those things are householder permitted development rights. You don't need planning permission. You can just go ahead and build it. It's all to cut red tape and make things a little bit easier and take some of the planning applications out of the system. So the government decided that the way to solve the housing crisis, partly at least, is to use these to extend permitted development rights to kind of commercial developments. So on the 1st of August this year, only a few weeks ago, a new permitted development right came in, which allows you to convert commercial premises, mostly shops and things like that, into flats. So the right is called Class MA, and it allows you to convert Class E commercial units into flats and houses. And Class E, for those of you who may not be fully aware, is shops, restaurants, creches and nurseries, what else is in there? Offices, light industry, and things like that. So there's a whole host of things that you can now convert into flats and houses under this new Class MA permitted development right from the 1st of August.
So that could create new properties for landlords to buy.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if you happen to already own, for example, a shop with flats above or something, or you have an office, or you have a building that was recently a creche or something like that, you could, and perhaps it's now empty because of the pandemic. We know that vacancy rates are now very high. You could apply to convert that premises into a new, or more than one new flat or house.
Okay, Angus, any advice for landlords thinking about this when you consider the finance that might be required?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to understand. I think it depends whether you own it already or whether you're looking to purchase something. You need to look and say, well, what's the structure I need to do? How big a job is it? Do I need to do a bridging loan to purchase the thing, and then remortgage it to a buy-to-let? There are various products out there which we can help you with, and there are other things you can do. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day who was looking to use his SAS pension, because you can buy commercial property with a SAS pension and then flip that into residential and sell it as it became residential. So there are some clever ways people can use any assets they've got in terms of funding such a purchase and conversion. But I mean, I've got so a question for you, Martin. I mean, you talked about sort of you've got permitted development rights and then applying. What's that process look like, and what should I consider if I'm converting, say, an office building into a couple of flats? Are there some special things I should be considering as part of that conversion process?
Yeah, yes. So I said that some permitted development rights don't require any kind of application. So if you're extending your house or whatever, you can, in principle, you can just do it. You already have permission. But for these new permitted development rights for commercial to resi conversions, you do need to apply for what is called prior approval. Now, you might ask, what is the point if you're still applying for something? How is it different to a planning application? But the prior approval process is meant to be quicker and easier, and there's a very limited number of things that the council has the power to look at. With a planning application, it can look at really whatever it wants. There's a whole range of things. So with prior approval, there's fairly limited things that they can look at. But firstly, you need to make sure you comply with some criteria to confirm that you're eligible. So you need to be sure that your office building is indeed lawfully an office building. So this is an area in which people kind of fall down. They think in common sense terms that's an office building. There are people in there doing office type activities. But in planning, it's slightly different. It's slightly more rigorous. It needs to be lawfully an office, which means it needs to have had planning permission as an office sometime in the past, or it's been run as an office for more than 10 years, which means the use has become established or whatever. So you just need to be, you can't just kind of last week move some staff in and call it an office, if you see what I mean. So you need to make sure you're eligible. There's various criteria that kind of, it's all available online if you Google, but it's things like the building you can't convert more than 1,500 square meters. It can't be a listed building. You can't be in certain designated areas like a national park and stuff. Now, unlike some other permitted development rights, this new Class MA, it can be in a conservation area, which is helpful because there are so many of those around the country. So anyway, you make sure you meet those criteria, which are just qualifying criteria. There's no point if you don't meet those. Then your prior approval application, there are limited things that the council can look at, and they are things like flooding, contaminated land, parking, noise from nearby commercial premises, and there are more. But anyway, you get the idea, quite limited things. So you need to check if you're in a flood zone, and if you might cause harm in terms of flooding, you might need to just do a flood risk assessment. Check if there's some previous contaminating uses on the site. Check if you're in kind of an industrial estate or something, will the new residences suffer noise from a factory next door or something like that? So there are those kinds of things. And there's one last criteria, which is quite important. It was quite a big change. It came in April this year for all of the permitted development rights. And that is that you must meet the minimum sizes. There are national minimum sizes for new flats and houses. Before you didn't have to meet them, and you probably saw in the press people saying, oh, we're creating rabbit hutch type flats. The government responded to that by bringing in minimum sizes. So you do need, in a nutshell, the minimum size for any kind of flat in England is 37 square meters. But it's higher for extra bedrooms and things.
Yeah, there were some dreadful examples of offices being converted into, as you say, rabbit hutches, and the government seemed to respond very quickly to that. So that's good news. I've got a question here from Ian, Martin. Have the permitted development rights changed within conservation areas? You just mentioned conservation areas. So has there been a change?
Well, one thing I haven't quite explained yet is that this new Class MA right that came in on the 1st of August, a few weeks ago, is one of many. There are pre-existing other rights. The Class MA right actually replaced some other ones. There was a Class O that allowed office conversions. There was a Class M that allowed shop conversions and so on. So it's replaced those old ones. And it's broadly the same thing, but some of the detail criteria has changed. So you would need to check, I don't really remember off the top of my head, you need to check for each of the individual rights, but some apply in conservation areas, like new Class MA, it's fine in a conservation area. Others don't. So you just need to check with your planning consultant, or check, if you Google it, a lot of this information is fairly easily found online. So for conservation areas, as a rule of thumb, conservation area protects the appearance of an old, attractive area. So rights that might affect the appearance of the building are more likely to be excluded in a conservation area. So for example, a right to convert a shop and change the shop front, they're not likely, they would want you to submit a full planning application if you're changing the shop front, because it's a historic area and so on. So as a rule of thumb, if it's an internal change, for example, office to resi, normally fine, because you're keeping the office building as it is, you're only changing the interior, and that won't affect the conservation area. So that's kind of the rule of thumb, but check for each individual case.
And Ian should be checking with his local authority on their website, or?
Well, no, the permitted development rights are all national, so it applies everywhere in the country. So what you would need to do there is just check. There are resources online, if you Google, and various people have written articles on how these work, or you can check the actual permitted development legislation directly, or check with a planning consultant or somebody who can help, who knows about this stuff.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And under the new permitted development rights, would it make it easier for landlords to do something with an existing property, like add another story to it if they had a block of flats or something of that nature?
Yes, so there are new permitted development rights that came in last year, I think September 2020, and these allow additional stories to existing buildings. Now, this is really mad and exciting. It's a little bit odd. They've been talking about this for years, and I wrote an article for the Daily Mail back in 2016 in which I said it'll never happen. It doesn't make sense. They'll never introduce new permitted development rights for extra stories, because anyway, I thought it wouldn't work, make sense. I didn't know how they'd frame it and everything, but I was wrong, and they have now appeared. And actually, for people who have a portfolio of existing properties, this is a real opportunity. And if I had, a large number of properties, I would make a list of them, and I would look at them all individually and work out, can I use these rights on any of these? So there's a range of new rights to add extra floors. There's one that allows you to add a floor to a house just as an extension to that house. So you can go up one or two, I think, extra floors, almost like a super loft conversion. So that could be of use to some people. You might do it first, and then once it's extended, apply to convert it into flats. You might have a strategy like that. There's also a load of rights to extend almost any building upwards, to add 1 or 2 extra floors, as long as those floors are entirely new flats. This is again because the government's very keen to deal with the housing crisis. So you can do it to terraced or detached buildings, doesn't matter. You can do it to, they can be blocks of flats, they can be commercial, or they can be mixed. They could be a shop with flats above, an office and a shop and another office, whatever. So you can add 1 or 2 stories. There are, again, you need prior approval. There are various things they consider. There's various criteria and limitations, there's height limits and so on. And critically for these rights, there's 2 things the council can look at, which can be quite problematic. One is the design of the building once it's been extended, and the other is impact on neighbours, because obviously additional floors can overshadow or whatever. But I must say that's I think investors and developers haven't quite cottoned on to this particular right yet because it's a bit random. But there are good opportunities. So for example, imagine if you're a landlord and you have a bungalow somewhere in the country. Bungalows tend to have quite a large floor plate. They tend to have a big ground area, but be short, obviously. And this new right will allow you to put, on a bungalow, you can only put 1 extra floor. But that 1 extra floor, because of the big floor area, might give you 2 flats.
Yeah.
So under these new permitted development rights, your little bungalow, you can add 2 flats on top, which clearly is a lot of extra added value. And people aren't, it's quite a curious little thing. So people aren't quite onto it yet. Now you might ask, well, if the council can look at the design and all that, don't they just refuse it? And yes, there's a very high refusal rate for a lot of these things. But the success rate at appeal, if you appeal the decision to central government, is very high. And that's because these new permitted development rights were introduced by central government, and its impetus is to get grant permission where possible. So they'll take quite a generous approach, unless it's a terrible scheme, but that won't get through. But they'll be quite generous. So you need to be prepared to appeal. You need to apply knowing you might end up at appeal, and certainly don't give up if the council refuses you.
So your first step would be to seek prior approval, and that's the first step of the process?
Yeah. Yes.
That's really
so if you have a property that you think this might work on, look up the process yourself, or hire a consultant who can, for a relatively small fee, they'll just assess it against the various criteria and let you know, because there might be something that rules it out. You might be in a certain area or something that rules it out. So you don't want to waste your money. There's a tendency for people to think, oh, I can do this. And then they hire an architect, spend thousands on plans, apply, but they were never really going to get it. There was something that precluded them from getting it, ruled them out. So pay a little bit of money for professional advice. And then if it works, go the whole
then
ball.
move to the architect and actually make it happen. That's really interesting. Yeah. Something that comes up an awful lot, Martin, and we were chatting about it before we went live, is HMOs and the planning permission required for HMOs. I mean, I see it a lot of Facebook groups. Oh, I've got this property, I want to convert it into an HMO. What are the planning permissions you might require for that, and what is the process?
Right. Well, there are 2 different types of HMO in the planning world. One is a HMO with 3 to 6 occupiers, and the other is a HMO with more than 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, whatever occupiers. The second is called a larger HMO, and that is what we call use class sui generis. Don't worry too much about the complicated terms, but it just means that it always needs planning permission. So if you want to have a HMO with 7 or more people, you will need planning permission. A smaller HMO, 3 to 6 people, was traditionally permitted development, that term again. So you could take a house or a flat that maybe was occupied by 1 person or a family. You could rent it to 3, 4, 5, or 6 sharers. They might be students or professionals or whatever. And that did not need planning permission. However, individual councils have the power to remove any permitted development right by issuing what's called an Article 4 direction. So this term now, if you're a HMO landlord, you will sadly have come across it by now, I think, because it's a very hot topic. So an Article 4 direction removes a particular permitted development right in a particular area. It could be the whole district of a council, but they need to specify the area. And essentially what's happening more and more is that councils are coming under some pressure from residents and so on, because there's some opposition to HMOs. They're kind of perceived by some people to be problematic in an area. They come under pressure, they say, right, we're going to just take away the right to create even a smaller HMO in this district through an Article 4 direction. And that, it's kind of crazy when you think about it, because it means you can't rent. You know, you might be a homeowner and you're moving abroad for work. You're not a property person, you're not a landlord, you're not interested in that whole world, but you think, well, I'm going to move abroad, I'm going to rent it for a year. And you think the estate agent brings you 3 students or 3 professional people sharing to rent your 3-bedroom flat. And you happily rent it because it would never occur to you there might be anything wrong. And then you get a knock on the door from planning enforcement saying, that's a smaller HMO, 3 to 6 sharers. You're in an Article 4 area, you need planning permission, you're in breach of planning, and we could take enforcement action. So this is a big, big area of planning, and it's a kind of a new thing. The Article 4s were rare before, and now they're really mushrooming. So where you might be a really experienced HMO landlord with a huge portfolio, you've been doing it for decades, and you might think, well, I've never had problems. You're probably, you're at risk of problems now, because really there's 2 sides to the problem. One is the controls are tightening through things like Article 4, but secondly, councils are just on it a lot more. So before they turned a blind eye, if they saw somebody renting 7 rooms, it's a larger HMO, it's always needed planning permission. They just didn't care, unless people complained, they didn't care. Now there's such opposition to HMOs, particularly in certain councils, that they are really pursuing these cases. So people who've had HMOs for 30 years are finding they're getting knocks on the door from the council saying, are you sure you've had it for 30 years? We need proof. We need evidence that this is lawful. So planning and HMOs are suddenly becoming a big area. Before it was all about licensing, but now planning is something that HMO landlords need to understand.
Because when we were chatting before, you were saying you could decide you wanted to buy a property, be midway through the process, and bang, Article 4 comes in. Has that actually happened?
Yeah. Yes. So the Article 4 directions can happen quite quickly. I mean, if you're a real council geek and you monitor their website and monitor their press releases and their communications, you'll probably have heard about it. But the councils are constantly consulting on different changes. They do public consultations, but they pass, those kind of things pass most of us by unless you're really paying attention. So the Article 4 can come in very quickly. Some Article 4s are what they call immediate, which means they just take effect straight away. Others, best practice is to give a year's notice, so they take effect after a year.
Okay.
In theory, the council is liable for compensation if they make an immediate Article 4 and this direct cost to someone. I'm not sure in practice how often they pay compensation and how you go about claiming it. So that's why a lot of them do wait the year. If they give a year's notice, they're free of the compensation risk. But unless you very closely watch what's happening in a council, you could very easily be caught out. You could agree to buy a house, and in 3 months, by the time you've done conveyancing, there's an Article 4 has appeared. So, obviously your solicitor should be checking a lot of this stuff, but it's very important if you're in HMOs, buying a HMO, already have HMOs to just check with your local council.
Yeah. What we're finding with lenders is some of them are much hotter now on making sure that the proper planning permission is in before you can remortgage your property. And Martin, what's your experience if a landlord has got an HMO property in one of these Article 4 areas but doesn't have planning permission? What are their options at that point?
Well, the sad reality is that it's hard to get planning permission in an Article 4 because council has deliberately brought in the Article 4 on the basis that they don't like HMOs in that area. So when a planning application comes in, they're likely to refuse it. Now, it depends on the council. So, for example, Portsmouth, I'm dealing with a case at the moment, Portsmouth have very specific planning policies on HMOs. They say that, I may get this slightly wrong because off the top of my head, but it's something like if you need to draw around the application property, draw a radius of 50 meters, and if more than 10% of the houses or flats in that radius are already HMOs, they won't allow you have permission. So there's an example of something where there's a specific criteria. You'll either meet it or you won't. You need to just look it up, and then you need to work it out. And if you meet it, you're fine. If you don't, you probably won't get permission unless you can come up with some exceptional reason why yours should be allowed. In other areas, they just have policies ruling them out altogether. So Newham in East London is kind of a famous one. They have very strong planning policies that say our area has way too much temporary housing and transitory people moving, coming and going, and we will not allow any more HMOs of any kind in this borough. And that's been tested at appeal. I've done some appeals in Newham on this, and we've lost, they've won. So, you know, you won't get a new HMO. Broadly speaking, there's always a chance, of course, but you won't get a new HMO in Newham. They have an Article 4 as well. So your best bet there, if you're a landlord, is to buy an existing one. And the good news, actually, just as an aside, if you're a landlord in an area and you've obviously if you've a HMO before the Article 4 comes in, you're safe. But once it comes in, the Article 4, HMO values kind of rise in that area, I think, because suddenly you have a scarce commodity. They can't create any more. So if you're in a busy student area and the existing stock of HMOs just won't get any bigger because of these planning controls, then I think existing houses and flats, non-HMOs, fall slightly in value because landlords are no longer buying them to make HMOs. But existing lawful HMOs rise slightly in value because the only way to get into that sector in that area would be to buy an existing HMO. So it's not all bad news if you're an existing landlord.
So there's an opportunity if you can identify which areas are likely to introduce Article 4s over the next couple of years. So those who are going through some consultation, that's a good opportunity and good location for a landlord who wants to buy an HMO to look now, because that would give him the grandfather rights for that.
Yes, and of course, remember, it's very easy to create a HMO. So if you thought, if a local council near you announces that in a year's time an Article 4 is coming into effect, you can go buy a house, or you may already own a house or flat, and just rent it to 3 people. And you've automatically changed the use and created a HMO. And that HMO, because it's pre the Article 4, is lawful. So it's not like you have to build anything. You don't have to buy an existing HMO. This is the reason why councils don't like giving the 1-year notice, because they're worried that loads of people in their area will just go out, and it's so easy to create a HMO just by changing who lives there.
Yeah. So if you had like a 3-bedroom house, maybe convert it into flats, how would you do that? Could you just do that without planning permission, or do you need to apply for planning permission for that? If you were converting an existing house into flats.
We don't need to convert it into flats, Chris. All you need to do is put 3 people in 3 of the rooms, and you create an HMO, and therefore you've got the grandfather rights. And I think for our landlords, that's actually something for them to think about. If they're in an area which they have the opportunity to do that today, that could then, in terms, if what Martin's suggesting here is that the value of that property as an HMO is higher post Article 4, that's quite interesting. I mean, and would you say that valuers are recognising that increased value in that property when they come to value it?
I'm not sure. It depends, I guess. It may take, if they're using the comparative method of valuation where they look at what sold recently in an area, then the increase in prices won't show up immediately. So it might take time for it to be identifiable. But I think in a year or two, if prices have edged upwards, then I think if you do create your HMO in that way, you're advised to get a certificate of lawfulness, which is a type of application to the council to confirm that your use is lawful. So in this case, it would confirm that you did create your HMO in time before the Article 4 came into effect. But I reckon this is my own kind of opinion. But I think if you were remortgaging or mortgaging, and you gave a valuer evidence, a copy of the Article 4, so that to show that it's an Article 4 area, and a copy of your certificate of lawfulness, which confirms yours is indisputably lawful, I think that could enhance the value, because I think a valuer would see that this is an area where HMOs are controlled, and you have an undeniably lawful one that is a relatively more rare commodity.
That's really interesting, isn't it, for the landlords? Very interesting. One thing also I sometimes see landlords thinking about buying a property, sometimes at auction. Can you get planning permission before you've actually bought a property, what should you be thinking about? If you've got in your own mind, oh, I could do this or this with this property, but you need to know, don't you? How can you be sure?
It's very tricky. It's very difficult. You can apply, anybody can apply for planning permission on any property. It's kind of an oddity of the system, but I could, if I knew your address, I could apply for an extension at your house if I wanted to. Anybody can be the applicant. I could put my name down as the applicant. The only thing is you must notify the true owner. So you serve a notice on them so that they're aware of it, but there's nothing they can do. It's an oddity of the system. So in print, so you could agree with the seller that you would apply at your own cost for XYZ, whatever it is you want, and that they would wait while that planning application was determined. As I say, you don't technically need their permission, but clearly you'd create bad will if you did just apply without warning. The difficulty, it takes kind of a month to prepare an application and about 2 months for a decision to come through, and you may need to appeal if they refuse. So timing is more the difficulty. Alternatively, you could apply for pre-application advice. So you pay the council to look properly at a proposal. Normally you sketch up some plans and stuff, and they will give you informal advice on whether it's likely to be accepted. The advantage of that, it's anonymous. You can do it on someone else's land and it's anonymous, so the seller won't ever know, at least in theory. So the disadvantage of it is that you often get a kind of a wishy-washy answer. So they say, well, we think this is okay, but you might want to look a bit more at the issue of flooding or something. And you're like, oh, well, that's not good. I don't have enough comfort from that to just buy. But it does help. It does give you a steer. And it's quite a common, when I worked at councils, we had pre-apps in all the time from developers who were looking at plots of land, and they'd hassle you very quickly. They'd be desperate for a quick answer because they're... But there are other ways of doing it. You can do subject to planning permission. So you can agree to buy a property subject to planning permission. Normally you're paying a slight premium, but then if you get the planning permission, you've enhanced the value, you go ahead and buy it. The win-win for everyone. The seller gets slightly more than they were going to get. You've enhanced the value. It's worth more when you buy it than it was before. So there are various mechanisms. The other thing you can do is get professional advice. So hire a planning consultant for a few £100 to give you a view. They spend a couple of hours doing a desktop review, and they give you what they think you can do at the land and their degree of confidence. So I would say to a client, I've 70-80% certainty you'll be able to get a house here or whatever. And then it's up to them whether they have a better idea, and then it's up to them whether they take the risk or not.
Excellent, that's good. Any more questions from anyone on the floor? Because we'll be sort of wrapping up soon. If anyone has any questions you want to put to Martin, our planning permission expert, and you think you're struggling with, do let us know. I was just going to ask Martin, what are the common mistakes that landlords make on planning permission? Are there any howlers that we should all avoid, or assumptions that people make?
Well, one thing I would say, it's advice I give to landlords, especially those with slightly larger portfolios, is that most people I come across have a load of unexplored value in their properties. And I kind of say this because I made the same mistake. I had the first flat I ever bought, 2004, when I was an estate agent myself. I bought a flat to live in, my very exciting first time buy and everything. And I moved on after a while, and I kept it and let it out. And it wasn't until 2015, 11 years later, that I realized I could put a whole new flat in the loft. It had an unusually big loft space. So in 2015, I applied for planning permission and got a new studio flat in the loft. It was my first property development. It was the first time I moved on from kind of conventional buy-to-let investing. And I kicked myself. I had been working as a planner for 10 years, and I'd never seen this clear potential in my own property. And I did it first, and then but by chance this flat was in a converted house, and there were 4 houses of the same design on this corner, and because it's on the corner, we had slightly bigger lofts basically, and all 4 have now done it, so they followed my example. And actually I acted as planning consultant for 2 of them, so at least I earned some money back that way. So I do reviews for landlords sometimes. They just give me a list of 20 addresses, and I go on Google. I take a day and I go on Google satellite view, and I look at all their properties, and I say, look, why haven't you? That one you could you've a ground floor, 1-bedroom flat there. Why don't you extend to the back 4 meters, put in a second bedroom, and in that area, 1 bed is only worth 200, a 2-bed is worth 400, something like that. You can add value. Or, I have a client at the moment, another client at the moment who's putting a flat in the loft, actually. So the first thing I say to people is there's unexplored value in your existing portfolio. Either to just sweat the asset a bit more and just householder extensions, or sometimes you can extend the ground floor flat enough that you can cut it in 2 and you've got 2 flats there, something like that. So that's the first thing. But your question was more about the common mistakes people make when applying for planning permission. A lot of this stuff in my book, by the way, if you don't mind briefly plugging.
And tell us again the name of the book.
It's How to Get Planning Permission and Insider Secrets. So it's everything I've learned over the years as a consultant, but also particularly from working in council planning offices. And it's 200 pages of tips and tricks. But my number one bit of advice to people, the number one mistake people make, and it really is very common, is they choose the wrong agent, architect. And this isn't a plug for planning consultants, because in a lot of cases you don't need a planning consultant for something small, but you do need a good architect or designer or agent or draftsperson, whatever you want to call them. So I would recommend everyone spend a lot of time choosing carefully. Don't underspend, don't go for the cheapest option, because too many applications are submitted that are kind of half-baked. Not enough time and energy has been put into making them really carefully designed, to thinking about all the elements. And a planning application costs. To do it right is expensive. So if somebody's quoted you £500 for your plans and to submit your application and to manage it and to harry the case officer and to try and to go to the site visit and all that, that's not enough. They can't do all that for £500, for example. So don't fall into the trap of getting a kind of a cheap job, because you'll get a cheap outcome. So that's my number one tip. Choose a good local architect. And if they're a bit expensive, it's worth it, because you're getting a several £100,000 uplift you're hoping maybe from your development. So if it's costing another couple of thousand up front, do it.
That's good advice. So a question here from Paul for you, Martin. Can we have a quick review or summary of the new permitted development rights? So permitted development rights in a nutshell, Martin.
Okay, no problem. So on the 1st of August this year, a few weeks ago, we got Class MA, which allows you to convert Class E commercial premises into flats and houses. Class E commercial premises are shops, restaurants, creches and nurseries, offices, light industrial. There's a couple more that I can't quite remember, but the list is online on my website and other various websites. That's Class MA. And then you have got the upwards extensions. That's the other big series of rights that came in 2020 last year. And they allow you to extend a house upwards, to just make it a bigger house, or to extend almost all buildings upwards to add extra flats. They're the main two. There are others. There are a host of other smaller ones out there. Some have been around for years. Some are newer. You can change an amusement arcade into, there's different ones that would be difficult to cover here in any detail, but they're the two big ones, the upwards extensions and the Class MA.
Paul, I hope that helps. Anything more from you, Angus, before we close? We've nearly run out of our time.
Well, I have to, Martin, I found it absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
It's been an eye-opener for me, and I hope it's going to be an eye-opener for our many landlords, because understanding what the potential is in terms of your property portfolio, I think that's the biggest thing that comes out of it for me. We've got a lot of landlords with multiple properties, and they probably should be, rather than just go and buy another property, maybe they should be looking at what can I do with my existing property to extend the value within that. I think there's probably quite a lot of hidden value with some of our guys. And I think just understanding HMOs and the HMO rules and how you might be able to take advantage. Yeah, the Article 4 stuff is a real pain for landlords, but if you understand what's coming, maybe there's an opportunity there. So I'm just trying to say, well, what are the opportunities for landlords that they should be looking at now, and how can we as their broker help them? So Martin, I think it's been a very interesting session. I hope people go out and buy your book. I know I'm going to try and have a Google and see if I can find it. And thank you for coming along.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin. And your website, it's Just Planning, isn't it?
Yeah, just-planning.co.uk and also martingaine.com. You can find me there too.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Martin, for all your time. Thank you.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.